Okay, welcome back to the Retro Rangers podcast. I'm George Grimm, and I'm here with former Associated Press sports writer and author of many books on many sports, Hal Bock. We're joined this evening by author
Jay Moran.
who wrote a book called The Rangers, the Bruins, and the End of an Era. Now we're going to be talking about the Derek Sanderson fight in the 1970 playoffs, and also the death of Terry Sawchuk a few months later. Now this all happened 50 years ago, if you can believe that. 50 years have passed since this happened. So now the 1970 playoffs, the Rangers ended up in fourth place, and they had to play the Bruins, who ended up in second place. Now, if you recall, the Rangers only made the playoffs because they scored 9 goals in the last game of the season to beat Montreal and edge themselves into the playoffs. Now, you would think that after a game like that, they might enter the playoffs with a little bit of momentum. But this is the Rangers, and we don't work that way. So. The Rangers lost the first 2 games in Boston, 8-2 and 5-3, and then they came home to play the Bruins for 2 games. You want to pick it up, Jay?
Oh yeah, right early into the game, about a minute and a half in, there was a face-off, and Ed Jockman skated out and said something to Derek Sanderson. Puck was dropped, and immediately a big brawl started. There were 132 penalty minutes in the first period alone. I mean, this game set all sorts of records. 174 total penalty minutes, 38 penalties. The game took over 3 hours to play.
It took 19 minutes to play the first 91 seconds of the game.
Yeah.
Actually, there's a picture of the brawl that happened in the corner. And
it's on the cover of my book, yeah.
Cover your book, yeah. Okay.
So I guess it comes down to what did Sanderson say, and then was this Eddie doing something to get the team motivated to get them going? When I interviewed Sanderson, he told me that Jockman said, "We're going to get you, and there's a bounty on your head," and I did a couple of quick references. Hugh Delano wrote a book, Eddie, a Goalie Story, and Sanderson claimed that Eddie said, "We're going to get you and put a bounty on your head," and Sanderson replied, groovy, that's cool. Gerald Eskenazi, he wrote A Year on Ice, said the same thing there. He claims that Eddie said, "We're going to get you," and Sanderson said, "That's cool." And
did you ever talk to Jockman about it? Did Jockman confirm that?
I talked to him, but not for the book, and he just almost said he couldn't remember, but he said, "Keep your head up," or something like that to him. When I interviewed Derek for my book, he said that he made the whole thing up. The whole bounty thing was going back to 1965 when the Rangers played and the Bruins, and Teddy Green speared Phil Goyette. And after the game, Stan Fischler interviewed Jennings, and he got him to say that Derek's an animal, there should be a bounty on his head. So,
well, in 2015, when I interviewed Sanderson, he, the whole thing was made up. He didn't say any of that. He made it all up, and he said that he went down to um, after the brawl, he was thrown out of the game. He went down to the locker room, and the reporters followed him along with Paul Anka. Somehow Paul Anka got in there, and with everyone around, he he had an audience, so he made it up, and that was what went out back there. It made headlines. Sanderson was a star back then, and he made headlines, and that's how that blew up.
Well, but he was a villain. He was a villain in the relationship between the Rangers and the Bruins.
Oh, sure.
He was not a favorite of any of the Rangers. So it's entirely possible that they were going to target him. They had to do something. They're down 2 games in the playoffs, and they had to win this 3rd game. So they had to do something to fire the team up, and he was a perfect target for the Rangers to go after, because he was a villain. He was one of the bad guys, Phil Esposito was a terrific goal scorer, but he wasn't hated the way Derek Sanderson was, in my recollection.
Oh, no.
So I'm not surprised that would have taken place that way.
Yeah, he was also a very good on the face-offs and the penalty kill, so he was very good for the Bruins in that respect.
Yeah. No question.
Yeah.
He was a good hockey player. He had tendencies to do some dirty things.
Yeah, he had an
from now and then. So that he was a kind of a villainous character.
Yeah. As far as what was said, I interviewed a handful of players that were on the ice for that: Arnie Brown, Eddie Westfall, Walker Chook, Dallas Smith, Rick Smith, and Bob Nevin, and basically all said they couldn't hear what was said or they didn't remember. Basically, they were too far away. I think the consensus from other sources was that Eddie said, keep your head up or we're going to get you, and then they swore at one another a couple of times. Yeah. The fight, I think definitely inspired the Rangers, but Arnie Brown hurt his knee and was never the same after that from that fight, and he missed the next game. What else from
the Rangers
that
won
fight?
that game 4-2 and 4-3, and they won the next game 4-2. So they went back to Boston, tied 2-2, and then they lost the 5th game, and they lost the 6th game. So for the 4th year in a row, they were out of the playoffs after the opening round. They wouldn't get past the first round until the year after, when they beat the Maple Leafs and they lost to Chicago. So.
Well, in those years, the league, first of all, it was a 6-team league, and 4 teams would make the playoffs. The first 4 teams would make the playoffs. And my recollection of those times were that the Rangers and the Bruins were both tail enders, and they were both battling for the 4th place, for that 4th place spot to get into the playoffs. So that's part of what I'm sure Jay would confirm, that's part of what the rivalry was built around, because they were always at each other's throats for that last playoff spot.
Yeah. And then they both started getting better at the same time and, went higher in the standings, and the rivalry intensified. Right. I think the Bruins had maybe a few more rough characters on the team than the Rangers did. Yeah,
they had a good up and down team. They all played their positions very well. After the Rangers series, the Bruins went on to beat Chicago. They swept Chicago, and then they swept the St. Louis Blues to win the cup. And that was the goal where Bobby Orr was flying through the air over Glenn Hall after he got bumped by Noel Picard, I think.
Yeah, Noel Picard.
Yeah. That series also marked the last of Terry Sawchuk's career. In fact, in your book, Guardians of the Goal, the picture that I gave you of Sawchuk, that's from his last game that he ever played.
Yeah.
It was in that series.
Yeah,
you know, there's another irony of let me, before we get into Sawchuk, go back to Sanderson. As hated as he was, A, by the Rangers and B, by the Ranger fans, he wound up playing for the Rangers in 1974.
Yeah. And he had a very good year.
And he had a pretty good year. He scored 25 goals.
25.
I find that very, very ironic, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Francis had a lot of respect for him. He really appreciated his skills, especially on face-offs. Yeah. And then when Derek did get to New York, he talked to someone like Sawchuk, and they both had hated each other on the other teams, but they both said, "Hey, we're on the same team now, so all's good."
Yeah. Well, in 2017, when I interviewed him, he was really a nice guy. He gave me, a lot of his time. He was humble and honest. He was a really good interview. I was so, all those years that he was, up there. I really hated the guy. When he was, with the Bruins, but he was really a fantastic interview. So.
Oh yeah, I found that true too. I remember one time though he in this fight he was upset that he didn't take out someone better, as far as game misconduct. He wanted Park or somebody else, and
I think Ballon went out.
Yeah,
I think he ended up taking up Dave Ballon. So.
I can't remember which. But I think it was later on, maybe the '72 series, that he got into a fight with Gilbert, and Gilbert got thrown out, and he was happy he took out someone of that quality.
Yeah.
Well, he was an instigator. That's another thing.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
Rod was not a fighter. Rod played his position, scored a lot of goals, and stayed out of trouble. But Sanderson was an instigator, and that was a lot of the games in those days. Guys would target the best player on the other team and try to take him out, which made a lot of sense. And strategically, that made a lot of sense. And so Rod had a job staying out of trouble, because often other teams would go after him, knowing that he was the best scorer on the ice for the Rangers.
Well, like Montreal always used to send John Ferguson out after him.
Mm-hmm.
And,
That's right.
He was big, tough fighter. He's a good player, but he was a big, tough fighter. And Gilbert couldn't handle that.
I asked Sanderson, well, why didn't you go after someone like Rattel, who had, he was a very good scorer? And he said, well, there's no honor in taking someone out. He's a gentleman, you get no points for trying to pick a fight with him. And I always wondered, well, how did Rattel come up? And he never fought. I don't think he had any majors, but when you're first coming up, you're going to be tested. Definitely, and unless you had a reputation, maybe in the minors, for never fighting. But, why didn't not only Sanderson but other players, knowing the skills of a Rattel, try to get into fights with him? But he never fought. It can't just be that, he's a gentleman. We don't play that way. You don't get points, for fighting a person like that.
Yeah. Well, they had respect for him, like you said, but... It's true. I don't. You have to, wonder what happened there. Well, he had Vic Hatfield on his line towards the, 60s there. But when he came up earlier, he was on the line with Camille Henry and Rod Gilbert. So, who's going to protect him there? 'Cause,
yeah, that's why Hatfield was added to the line, a little more muscle. He was, Vic was a fighter, especially early in his career there. Rangers had Kurtenbach.
Yeah,
he was a presence. So they didn't have a lot of fighters, but they had some big guys. Teddy Irvin, some.
Hatfield probably saved him from a lot too. Cause
well, when they got Ted Irvin, they got him in a trade for Camille Henry, and
no, that was
first of all, Cammy was
Robin.
a tremendous favorite here in New York, and the deal was made because Camille Henry was about 5'10", and Ted Irvin was about 6'3", and Emile wanted more muscle. He wanted the guys to be bigger, his team to be bigger. And that trade really raised a ruckus because Camille was such a popular player here in New York.
Yeah.
And Irvin was kind of a non-entity pretty much. But, it's a strange game sometimes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that brings us to Terry Sawchuk. Now Sawchuk was one of the best goalies in NHL history of his time. He played for 21 seasons. He won 4 Stanley Cups, 4 Vezina trophies. He was a 7-time All-Star, and he's in the Hockey Hall of Fame. So, and he has 103 regular season shutouts. That's amazing. So he the spring of 1969, the Rangers needed a backup goalie. They had been using Don Simmons, and Simmons retired, and Emil wanted someone who would just be able to play, half a dozen games, maybe 8 games, 10 games, and Sawchuk was the best one out there. So he was 40 years old, and the Rangers got him. And Emil was surprised when he was in camp because when he played, he was like 220 pounds earlier in his career. But when he came to the Rangers, he was 180. So Emil was really shocked at his appearance. But he did what he was asked to do. He played in 8 regular season games. He went 3-1-2. His 103rd shutout came on February 1st, 1970 at the Garden, and that was the same place that in 1950 that he actually recorded his shutout in his rookie year against the Rangers. So. And then after this, after the Rangers lost to the Bruins, Sawchuk had been rooming with Ron Stewart, and they were old teammates from the Maple Leafs, and they both liked to drink, and they both sometimes got into trouble when they drank, and they were in a bar drinking, and they had an argument about cleaning up the rental house that they had, who owed who money and who had to clean this and clean that, and the bartender threw them out of the bar, and they fought outside the bar, and then the bartender sent them home. So they each got into their own cars and drove home, which is not good. But and then they went home, and on their front lawn they had a fight. They were pushing and shoving each other. And Sawchuk fell on either a barbecue pit or on his knee, and he ended up with ruptured spleen and a torn liver. So he was in bad shape. He was in the hospital for quite a while. And
they had to do a couple operations.
Yeah. So, and he passed away about 3 weeks later on May 29th, and Emil had to come back from a scouting trip and claim his body from the morgue in New York City, and it was a sad day for the Rangers and for hockey, and
It's a bizarre way for an all-time great for his career and his life to end. I mean, Terry Sawchuk is right up there with Plant and Glenn Hall and all of those legendary goaltenders of the 60s. And for him to die in that bizarre, really bizarre. That's the only word I can think of. In that bizarre fashion, kind of strange, really is, you know.
Yeah, and the Rangers were accused of covering it up because they didn't let the press know that he was in the hospital, but the real reason was they were trying to get in touch with Sawchuk's father to let him know what had happened. That's why the press was kept out of it for a while. Yeah. That brought in an incident, too, where Stan Fischler's wife, Shirley, got an interview with Sawchuk, and she never said she was a reporter. And and he did say, well, we were just horsing around, it was an accident, it was nobody's fault, but that got Emil Francis very mad, and he took away her credentials, and eventually
there was bad blood between Emil and Fischer for a long time from that.
Well, there was bad blood between the Rangers and Fischler. I remember Muzz Patrick, really, when Muzz was the general manager, really got into it with Fischler. I saw it happen. Fischler was a gadfly. He liked to stir things up, and that caused some friction between him and the organization. And so it was not surprising to me that Shirley Fischler, his wife, would sneak into the room. You know, that's not exactly journalistic ethics to pull a stunt like that. And so I wasn't amazed at it, really.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was after that or before that, probably before, she was the first woman in the locker room, and she won in court for that right. So it had to be before this incident, I would think.
Well, I was directly involved in that affair. I was the president of the Hockey Writers Association. And she applied for membership. And I said, wait a minute, because your husband is a hockey writer, that doesn't make you a hockey writer. She had zero credentials as far as I was concerned. And that got into kind of a messy argument between our organization and the Fischlers. And I wound up one day at the AP. I was working at the AP, and I was served with a summons to appear before the Human Rights Commission or something like that. And it happened that my boss was walking by when they served me with the summons, and he kind of looked at me like, what? What is going on? I didn't need that, really, in my career. But so that was a very messy time between the Fischlers and the Rangers and the Hockey Writers, because I questioned her credentials. You're married to a hockey writer. Thank God you're not married to a brain surgeon, or you'd think you were a brain surgeon. It's you got to establish yourself before you can be accepted into our organization. Well, she wound up being in the organization. Bill Jennings really had a major role in settling that little argument. And he came to me and he said, look, let her in, and that'll settle it. It's foolish to carry on this way. And so that was the background of her becoming a hockey writer. But I just found it bizarre, again, and I use the same word, bizarre, that this kind of an argument should take place. I mean, what makes you a hockey writer? If you write hockey, then you're a hockey writer. Well, don't come to me and tell me you're a hockey writer when you've never written any hockey. That was my argument. So.
And Stan was critical of Sawchuk being on the team, only to the point that he was thinking Francis was remembering his glory years, and the man was actually a little, over the hill to be playing. They had Villemure in the minors, and Villemure thought he was going to be brought up until they traded or they acquired Sawchuk.
I think Francis knew that Eddie was going to play most of the games, and he didn't want Jules sitting on the bench. He did bring him up the next year, and that was when they won the Vezina together. So Jules is a very good goalie. But
But what surprised me was Francis told me that he was going to bring Sawchuk back for one more year. And I said, really?
Really?
Because, yeah, when I interviewed him, it's in the book, and that surprised me because I thought, he knew, and people were trying to get the Rangers to trade Villemure to them because they knew how good Villemure was. And
yeah, he was the best goalie outside the NHL.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as the other person involved in the Sawchuk affair, that was Ron Stewart. He was brought up on charges, but they, he was cleared. The Rangers got him a lawyer, and he was cleared. And Emil brought him back for another season or two, and he actually ended up coaching the Rangers in 1975. That was Emil's last hire as coach. So, they didn't hold it against him or anything. They realized it was
No.
So, but it's a shame. It's that. And
I mentioned earlier the irony of Derek Sanderson winding up playing in Ranger Blue that one season, but they also made the big trade. Jay mentioned Jean Rattel. Rattel wound up in Boston along with Brad Park, and the Rangers got Phil Esposito, who at that time was probably the biggest name in the league because of his goal-scoring ability, and Carol Vadnais in that trade. And that really broke up that old gang of mine, really, because shortly thereafter, Eddie Jockerman wound up playing for the Detroit Red Wings. So Emil had made the decision to break up the team that had done very well for many years, but had not brought home the Stanley Cup, which was, of course, the ultimate goal. But it was ironic that the Bruins would send Phil Esposito and Carol Vadnais to New York, and the Rangers would send Brad Park and Jean Rattel. These were guys who were not just also rans on the roster. These were the stars of the team, both teams. So it was a blockbuster trade.
I had seen that Harry Sinden wanted to send, I think Dallas Smith with Espo, but Francis didn't want Smith, so he brought Vadnais over, and Vadnais, and supposedly Vadnais had it in his contract that he wouldn't get traded, after, like in October, November, something like that, only after the season. And so he held out for more money because they traded him, and he had to move his family and everything. So he held out for more money. So he got it. So.
And Rattel had a very good career in Boston. It actually extended his career. He had considered retiring at some point, but. He played almost, I think, up until 1980, 81 maybe. So he
stayed with the organization afterwards too. He worked in the front office.
Yeah. And I think Brad Park played more games for the Bruins than the Rangers.
Is that right?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, not many, but he did. So I think that might be one of the reasons why they haven't hung his number up, but. I don't know. I think he should have his number retired. He's Brad Park. He's the best defenseman we had back then. He was our Bobby Orr,
That's right.
That's right. He was.
He wasn't Bobby Orr, but he was, pretty close to it, And
so did he play with Orr in Boston?
I think for 4 games.
Yeah.
4 games?
Yeah.
That's it. And Orr's knee was so bad that,
And then Orr ended up in Chicago. How did that happen?
Orr played in Chicago briefly.
Yeah.
But he was done. You're right. The knees gave out on him.
Yeah. I think Al Nicholson arranged some kind of deal where he went to Chicago, and Orr didn't want to go or something. But
I don't remember the details now. But as bad as the Rattel trade was, I hated that trade. In '76, they traded Rick Middleton for Ken Hodge.
Yeah.
And I guess Esposito wanted his old buddy back, but he was a little over the hill then, and Middleton went on to, how many goals did he score? It's like, oh.
Well, the reason that John Ferguson gave was that they wanted to get Middleton away from the New York nightlife, and I think Walt McPeak said he wondered out loud if they didn't have bars up in Boston. So,
yeah,
that's supposedly why they got rid of Middleton. But yeah, he would have been fantastic down here. But we got Ken Hodge, and Hodge played maybe a season and a half. Hodge was part of the great right wing purge the following year when they got rid of Hodge and Bill Goldsworthy and Roger Bear right before Thanksgiving, and that was John Ferguson. So, and then I think that was the end of Ferguson too. So.
Yeah.
These are major transactions that were made in those days, and you don't see any of that today. I mean, I'm not as close to the game as I once was, but it seems to me that you don't have those kind of trades anymore. I mean, am I right or wrong?
No, you're right.
Well,
right.
You got salary caps. You got salary caps. You got no trade contracts. You got contracts where the guy can say, I don't want to go to Los Angeles. I don't want to go to Chicago. So
sure.
That happens. So,
and yet,
harder now to trade these guys.
Yeah, it is harder, and yet there seems to be more turnover. Not major trades, but more turnover. I mean, the teams back in the 60s and 70s, all the teams didn't change their rosters much around. And, nowadays it's much more fluid, but you're right, like a big name for big name, is not as common. Getting back to Terry Sawchuk for a minute, I wonder how today's players, how much they know their history. They might remember.
Not at all. I would guess not at all. The athletes that I've talked to over the years have very little appreciation of the history of the game. And I'll take you for a moment to baseball. When the New York Mets acquired Vince Coleman, who was a terrific base stealer with the Cardinals, and they came to the Mets, and he was in spring training, and we went up to talk to him, and they were getting ready to celebrate Jackie Robinson Day, which they do every year in April, to mark Robinson's debut with the Dodgers. And so we went up to Vince Coleman, who was a black player, and we said, what do you think about Jackie Robinson Day? And Coleman said he had never heard of Jackie Robinson. Who is Jackie Robinson? Well, I mean, now we have a real problem here,
Yeah.
So I think in general, I don't think the players of today have any appreciation for or interest in what went before. They're only interested in themselves and what's going on right now. That's my experience.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Because they don't read about the game. They don't care about.
I think they're so involved in playing the game from a young age that the history of the game is lost upon them and of very little interest to them. It's almost like the game started when they came along,
Yeah, yeah.
Well, when they're growing up and they're young, they would have a poster of someone, on their wall, which they had to be active. So, whoever they modeled themselves after or whatever, or who followed as a fan, they're not going to go back and put, say, Tony Esposito on their poster, on their wall, because that's a couple generations back. So, I could see a little of that with the younger players. Or so many games are available now with cable. You could see so many teams. Back then, you didn't see many teams unless
Well, I would think that a young goaltender coming up today, number one, has never heard of Terry Sawchuk. Or Tony Esposito. He may have heard of Martin Brodeur of the Devils, because Brodeur was such a great goalie, and he's of the modern generation. But I think the older player, I mean, there were goalies in the 6-team league that were unbelievably great. You talk about Glenn Hall of the Blackhawks. You talk about Sawchuk. You talk about Jacques Plante with the Canadiens. I mean, these were all-timers, and their names are lost in the annals of history to these modern players. That's what I believe.
Yeah, but those 6 teams. Yeah, Glenn Hall in Chicago, Plante in Montreal, Bauer in Toronto, Sawchuk in Detroit, and Gump Worsley in the Rangers here. All those guys are in the Hall of Fame. The only guy who's not in the Hall of Fame as a goalie, the only guy who's not in the Hall of Fame as a goalie is Eddie Johnston from Boston, and I think he might be in as a builder or something. I don't think not as a player, but they're all in the Hall of Fame. So, and they should.
I wonder if the Canadian players have a better sense of history. Like you say, a Ken Dryden, I'm sure they would, remember him.
I think you're probably right. Because that's their sport. It's the national game in Canada.
Right.
In the United States, and I worked hard alongside other people trying to improve it. But in the United States, hockey has always been number 4. You had football, baseball, basketball, and then you had hockey. And I loved the game, and I loved it when I worked in it. I loved it when I covered it. But you never could make a foothold. You couldn't get a foothold in this country, largely because there were no American players. Now, of course, there are American players today, but we're talking about 50 years ago. There were no American players. There was, I think, Tom Williams, who played for the Bruins. But other than that, there were no Americans. And it was hard, I think, for the American sports fan to buy into a game being played by what amounted to foreigners, Canadians. But, you had to put that aside and to just appreciate the game for what it was. And in my opinion, which counts for nothing, the game was a hell of a lot better in those days than it is today. I know that the players are bigger and stronger and faster and so forth and so on, but I think the game, for me, the game was more exciting in those days. There was more drama in the games. I don't know. That's just the way I feel.
It was more wide open, I think. And
yes, I think that's part of it.
You had more breakaways. You had more one-on-ones. Now everybody's everyone's in the slot trying to clog things up and around the net, and there's just no open play anymore.
Well, you couldn't stand in front of the net back then without being pushed around at least a little bit. There was now you can't touch anyone in the slot, so it's like.
But as far as the players from Montreal having their past in front of them, they have a poster that's over their lockers that says something like, "To you with failing hands, we pass the torch," and they have all these pictures of all the Hall of Famers, in the locker room,
Well, I got to tell you, I just wrote this for a publication that the AP circulates to its retired people. I was covering the playoffs in Montreal one year. They say there were ghosts in the Forum, in the Montreal Forum, Howie Moritz and that crowd. So anyway, I was covering the playoffs one year in the Montreal Forum, and when you work for the AP, there's a lot of work to be done, and it's not just one story. You're writing a lot of stories, and I was flying solo. I was working by myself, and I'm writing, and I finish up, and I become aware of the fact that there's nobody else left in the press box except yours truly. Well, that's okay. I'm done. I'm going to go back to my hotel. And I leave the press box, and I go down to the entrance to the building, and it's locked. I'm locked in the Montreal Forum with all these ghosts.
Wow.
Now I'm thinking to myself, what do I do now? Well, I found my way to the warehouse door, one of the back doors of the Forum, and there was an old French-Canadian watchman. Now, I took 4 years of high school French, not for nothing. So I walked up to him and I said to him, "S'il vous plaît, Ouvrez la porte. And he looked at me and he laughed. That means, please open the door. He laughed and he opened the door for me, and I got out and I said merci, which is thank you, and I went on my way. But that's one of my favorite adventures as covering hockey at the Associated Press.
Lucky guy. That's
that's right.
Yeah.
Were you able to see Sawchuk in person ever?
Me? Yeah, I saw him when he played for the Red Wings, sure.
Okay, yeah.
Not a lot, but I did see him play. There's no question. My recollection of the Red Wings goalie is Roger Crozier.
Yes.
But Terry was there when I first got there, I guess.
Yeah, he played for 6 teams, I think, and he played for Detroit and Boston, and went back to the Red Wings, and then Toronto, and he was drafted by the Kings. I think he was the first goalie drafted in the 67 expansion draft. And then he went back to the Red Wings, and then he came to the Rangers. So he got around. He had trouble too. He had a drinking problem, I think, at one point, and he had trouble with nerves and stuff at one point, and he had a breakdown when he was with the Bruins, and he missed most of his second season there. I think Don Simmons took his place, and then he went back to the Red Wings. So. But,
not to mention all the injuries he took, not wearing a mask and.
Well, there's that one picture that you see online once in a while. I think it was on Sports Illustrated, where they have him all carved up in his face with all the
it looks like he's wearing Jerry Cheever's mask. Yeah.
Yes.
You know what? I believe those guys were nuts to play barefaced. You have to have an awful lot of courage. I'll say that.
Yeah. Yep. And there was only one goalie. They had to play every game.
That's right.
That was in their job description. Play play every game. It was very rare that you had 2 goalies playing for one team back then.
Well, every team had an emergency goalie if the goaltender got hurt. The Rangers used a statistician named Joe Schaefer, who sat in the press box praying that he didn't have to go on the ice,
Yeah.
But he played a little bit. And every team was required to have a substitute goalie. The Red Wings' backup goalie was the trainer, Lefty Wilson.
Right.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've heard of him.
Yeah.
I think
different time. It was a different time.
Yeah, there was I think 2 games where Worsley got hurt in the Olympia, and the trainers had to come in and sub for him. One was Danny Olesevich, and the other one I don't remember his name, but they were like the odd trainer, the extra trainer for the team back then.
Well, we had this story this year where the Zamboni driver took over, and that was earlier this season. So sometimes things haven't changed all that much.
No.
Yeah. I think they even gave him his own jersey with a number on it after the game.
I think so.
Yeah.
I don't know what he was paid, but probably wasn't that much. But he had a ball. Playing, he won the game. He gave up his first 2 shots, but I think he stopped everything after that, and he won the game. So.
And he goes into the record books 1-0.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
And he did something we would all like to do.
I think so.
So thank you for being on, both of you. I appreciate it. I hope everyone is safe and well. Everybody wash their hands and don't touch your face, and keep
That's it. And wear a mask,
everybody.
like the goalies do.
Yeah, wear your mask. That's true. Yes, wear your mask. And we'll be back with the Ranger podcast soon.
Thanks for having me on. Love talking the old days.
Okay.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thanks.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.